I want to start my comments that, with some broader comments on your other works. I think Alex really insightfully combines political theory of migration with analysis of the social sciences and concepts developed by critical migration studies. And in this sense, I think it's really unique and rare perspective. And also, I think that he lays the argument to show that the errors of the theory based on methodological nationalism have also its practical implications. Methodological nationalism in political theory, as well as the social sciences, reflects but also legitimizes an inadequate practice of real politics, which is characterized by a dual approach of the current global political economy, which promotes transnational trade and markets without borders, while simultaneously placing the responsibility for global justice within the borders of the nation state, and thus creates any internal contradictions. Global interactions and conflicts within global capitalism create structural causes of migration, which cannot be fully understood from the perspective of methodological nationalism. And still, the international human rights regime and migration regimes exclude those migrating for non-political reasons, namely those who are fleeing from negative consequences brought by global capitalism. So this is my first point of appreciation. And I also like that you put under scrutiny the cognitive biases of the of the dominant approach in political theory, and you articulate a thorough critique of limited liberal approaches to cosmopolitanism, on basis of which you propose radical cosmopolitanism from below, starting from the perspective of migrants, their social struggles and lived experience of banal cosmopolitanism that you quote in your texts as a reference point of really existing processes of cosmopolitanism, to use Beck's concept. I agree that it is really important to emphasize the difference between the cosmopolitan critical social theory based on intersubjective ontology and historically contextualized and materialized analysis, and the liberal cosmopolitan theory based on overly individualistic ontology and ahistorical political abstractions and normative proposal. In contrast to liberal cosmopolitan theory, the cosmopolitan critical social theory formulates normative arguments based on the analysis of the really existing processes of cosmopolitanization and the social actors' claims, which I think is this cosmopolitanism from below. So the emphasis on really existing processes of cosmopolitanization, which was proposed by Ulrich Beck and others, makes cosmopolitan critical theory a counterpoint to this one-sided normative cosmopolitan political theory, which unfortunately the term cosmopolitanism is often wrongly equated with and on this basis rejected. Transnational migration practices are, as you said, manifestation of these really existing processes of cosmopolitanization. But at the same time, they are condition of the emergence of cosmopolitan consciousness, but at the same time it is true that the transnationalization of social practices is not the same as cosmopolitanism and does not necessarily lead to the emergence of cosmopolitan consciousness. However, these processes open a cosmopolitan moment. And even though migrants do not necessarily internalize a cosmopolitan consciousness, I think that it is fruitful to see them as cosmopolitan agents, as you said. I suggest that although migrants do not necessarily internalize cosmopolitan consciousness, if we understand these marginalized migrants as a structural group, and here I refer to the concept by Iris Marianiakis, we can capture their lived critique as an expression of their critique of legitimacy of present-day global order and a source of critique of global injustice and cosmopolitan claims for global justice. I think Alex aptly shows that migrant protests, movement, and a manifestation of this cosmopolitan moment, cosmopolitanism from below. And I agree with that, but also I think that it is important to go a step further, to pay, not to pay an exclusive attention only to traditional forms of political protests like demonstrations, strikes, and campaigns, which overlook a substantial part of protest in society. And these pre-political claims are expressed in actors' everyday struggles and lived critiques. I think that migrants' everyday action, from their decision to migrate, the manipulation of available resources and their legal options, also their distancing and criticizing being treated as a second-class people, is all an expression of their critique of a global capitalist system, and also of the nation-state-centered institutional framework which they are caught up in. And even though their struggles do not take the form of traditional political protests, I think they develop everyday critical strategies which challenges the system. Although migrants' everyday social struggles are seemingly individual, if we understand them as a structural group, we can address the collective features of these struggles and their generalizable claims for justice. The migrants have critique challenged the legitimacy of the current internationally defined institutional and legal framework, and I think also, I agree with you, represents normative claims for a cosmopolitan arrangement. And finally, I would like to make one comment and question. I agree that you didn't really mention it in this presentation, but in your written chapter, you have this point that migrant protests and claims are not necessarily cosmopolitan. A critical cosmopolitan theory must distinguish between justified and unjustified claims, because not all expectations of social actors are necessarily justified. And indeed, some of the expectations are based on xenophobic, racist, and sexist prejudice, such that their claims are articulated in opposition to other groups that would be excluded and denied recognition. And you also use this example of the danger connected with the dreamers. So claims of marginalized actors may also be misused by other groups and diverted by them to advance their own interest and to promote forms of exclusion or violence. In the context of structural misrecognition, marginalized groups of migrants can also be manipulated by the mass media against other migrant groups by means of false premises of inclusion and recognition of the condition of excluding others. So I have the question how you connect. Actually, this is the place where it is important to connect social science research and political theory. So if you also develop these lines of arguments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I'll try to be brief in answering what is an enormous bag of worms you open, because I think you're right. This is exactly sort of the site of where the social sciences meet political theory. And this is sort of the obvious question that, at least it's obvious to political theorists, which is they want to have a normative criteria. They want to be able to have some sort of criteria to distinguish between cosmopolitanism we should celebrate and movements that we should criticize. And they want to be able to say, what exactly that makes a movement cosmopolitan in a positive sense. And this is something that, I said in my monograph that Zuzana was talking about, which is social theorists, so much of the work in in the social sciences is, and I think this is fair, is implicitly normative. So it's extremely critical of certain types of unjust arrangements, but it often takes for granted that the arrangements are unjust. And often doesn't say a lot about what makes them unjust, and often for good reason, because often, the world's such a terrible place that it's kind of obvious. But what happens when you're talking about, say, trying to build new types of institutions? You seem to need some sort of criteria to be able to distinguish when you want to celebrate them, and when you want to say, hey, is that actually meeting the goals that we hope for? And that's what a lot of political theorists want to be able to do. They want to give a more explicit criteria for what's moral, what's immoral. And that's kind of a connection that I'd like to be able to make. What it is, though, is extremely hard to articulate. And I think there's a few things that can be said. I do think openness and inclusion should be the default. So when you're looking at any social institution, any type of exclusion needs to be justified. And so the onus is on people who want to exclude to explain why exclusion is justified. And sometimes it is. Some groups need to exclude, and some borders need to be partially closed. And I'm not thinking national borders, but I'm thinking about all the types of social borders and boundaries that allow us to flourish. But at the same time, I think openness has to be the default. I think as well, and I think Susanna may have some issues with this, but I think we need notions of human flourishing. We need to have some sort of sense in what makes people's lives go better, and I think we need to be explicit about that. And so we need to be able to tie institutions to a conception of what makes human lives go well. And there's different ways of doing that. Maybe I'll stop there, but other concerns are questions of equality, questions of distribution, and how are inequalities, how are they structured? And again, I think inequality, is the default position is equality, and there needs to be some justification for any type of inequality. So these are very sort of vague responses to a tough question, but I think this is sort of the work that political theorists need to do to better articulate institutions for, I guess, more robust cosmopolitanism.
Thank you. So, if you have any questions, yeah, and maybe we can take both.
Sure.
Thank you. It was really interesting to listen to your proposal and your conceptualization, and I really enjoyed your talk. So my question is maybe rather provocative, and is I really like your idea of cities as the place where global justice can take place. But my question is, why cities are good and the state is not? I mean, cannot state be that local that make human rights protected in that place? So I would like to listen.
My question is not really in terms of those, a little bit different. In terms of, with those your 5 points about ways forward, I mean, many of the things that I fully agree with what you're saying in terms of the methodological nationalism and then the challenges the migrants pose. But like Zsuzsanna, if I understand her also correctly, that I have a kind of a worry about the romanticization of migrants. In a way, maybe it might not be a bad idea to differentiate being cosmopolitan and cosmopolitan opening of the societies. Because migrants, if you do research with migrants, I mean, definitely it's very difficult to make cosmopolitans out of them, most of them. And in terms of being against the national state and nation state, and in terms of solidarity networks, in terms of openness. So if we argue about cosmopolitanism is about the nature of attachments, which are not mutually exclusive or closure, there it's very difficult. But on the other hand, I see that the presence of migrants and the challenges by their presence, through their claims, bind us in a way, in an unstoppable way, opens, provokes, or introduces openings, cosmopolitan openings in the society, no matter people want it or the states want it or not. So in terms of, my point is about, I know that you're not making a kind of a romanticization, but I see a kind of a danger in terms of migrant voices, in terms of from below. I mean, many right-wing and populism come also from below.
Yes.
So, and migrants are not very prone to that. So.
Yeah. Okay, those are really, really great questions. Let me try the second one first. Maybe I'll try to figure out an answer to the first one as I talk. I mean, you're absolutely right. Migrants are incredibly diverse, and the full range of, deeply insular, nationalistic to cosmopolitan is there. And I think, though, what Zuzana was saying, migrants as a structural group, maybe in some ways a more useful way of thinking about it, because I don't think it's necessarily migrants' intention. It's rather their presence and their actions necessarily open societies in some way, even maybe despite their intentions. And in terms of the normative, what we want is an openness. We want a world in which mobility is a normal process, and we want political institutions in which people can move without being killed for it. I mean, hopefully we can do better than that. But, we have a world that is mobile in so many different ways, and we need to figure out political institutions that are able to accommodate that mobility in a way that gives people autonomy, gives them political rights, and so on and so forth. And so I think I would take, if I understand your discussion correctly, migration as a process is kind of a key indicator for thinking about what these institutions might be. I guess I would push back a little bit in that, and maybe this is a little bit romantic, but looking at migrant protests, I do see solidarity, not only between migrants, but between a lot of other groups, including groups that are characterized as not being migrants. And I see a lot of hope and possibility in building types of solidarity. So across groups, within what's characterized as one society, across societies. And I do want to draw from that, but I don't want to generalize that to say, well, that's all migrants. Rather, it's an aspect of migrant political action, which I find inspiring, and I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about how you might actually build more progressive institutions, because I think that's actually being done in some cases. It's fitful, it's easy to be pessimistic, but occasionally it's inspiring, and I guess that's what I wanted to get there. The question about why cities rather than states. Can I just say that states just don't have a very good record? And I know that's not satisfying. I think, though, there is something to be said for cities in that we actually live in cities. It takes an enormous amount of energy to continually create this nation state as the imagined community. You have to do a lot of indoctrination, a lot of propaganda to get people to, well, first of all, to build the nation state, which is something fairly recent, and to get people to continually kind of reaffirm it. And I find often, what that affirmation turns out to be is something often kind of dangerous. So I guess that's my reading of nationalism. I mean, people tell me, fellow political philosophers tell me that it's kind of a unit of solidarity and so on and so forth. In cities, I find real solidarity. You actually interact with a significant number of the people in policies that vary directly, and there's a concreteness that I think is helpful in that you can see how problems are very explicitly manifest. And so I guess that's sort of my thought. I guess also, I think in recent years, this is certainly in the case of the United States, but I don't think exclusively the United States. Often cities seem to be a more actually progressive site of struggle. And so again, maybe there's a little bit of romanticism there. And then I realize, local politics can also be very oppressive. I mean, don't get me wrong there. But I do see at the level of the city some movements that make me quite optimistic, and see people from very different groups coming together. I think early in the morning there was mentioned, the relationship between Black Lives Matters and migrant struggles, and I thought with the Muslim ban in the United States, it was very interesting to see the Black Lives Matters groups, out marching with the different immigrant groups. And there's something I think kind of important there, because there's a way of drawing common cause against processes that affect detrimentally groups that are traditionally kind of pried apart and often kind of pitted against each other. And I think we're seeing at the level of the city, maybe people coming together. So I don't know if that's at all satisfying. You want to follow up?
We have some questions. And then Albert, if you can pass the mic. Well, Esther, please. Marek was first.
You can first and I will listen. Okay, no problem.
Well, thank you so much for your informative presentation and methodologically clear. But I am just wondering, maybe there was something that I missed. I would like you to give a bit of explanation about it. This is about cultural cosmopolitanism. I didn't hear about it. So if you can just repeat, because probably I missed it, so it will be interesting for me. Thank you.
Should I say it now?
Yes, please go.
Okay. Thank you for your illuminating lecture. It was inspiring for me, and I'm sympathetic to that. I would like to ask you concerning cosmopolitan agents. I agree with you that we should focus on them, and it should be, let's say, cosmopolitanism from below. But my question is, I think that we should focus on, let's say, real deep interests of those cosmopolitan agents, because I think that maybe I didn't understand it well, or maybe you have other analyses elsewhere I'm not aware of, so just maybe we'll agree. But I think that you started to analyze interest of cosmopolitan agents from the middle when they became migrants. But I think that sometimes they wanted to be migrants, let's say to come to the conference and so on, or to have a job here and so on. But many times they were forced to be cosmopolitans, And we have to look at those, not only at the consequences of migration and how to solve them, but about the sources of migration. So we have to take care about the real interest of those agents, cosmopolitan agents, those, let's say, next migrants, but before that, they were probably in very bad situation because of, let's say, illegal war in Iraq, or in other countries. So we should see their interest, and in fact, in their interest is that those who cause these problems should be punished. So those countries who occupied Iraq should be punished. War criminals should be taken to the International Criminal Court, to The Hague, and punished. And those occupying countries should pay reparations for Iraq and for all other countries which helped improve the situation. Second, there are economic problems of the global interactions. Of course, if those people are for decades exploited, or when they are consequences of colonialism and so, then because of economic reasons they move and they become migrants. But if we try to solve their real interest, I mean their poor situation in the place, I mean there can be better economic arrangement in trade and so on, then probably many people would not be migrants and they would stay because their situation would be better there. So I think that I agree with you that it's important to address the issue as you do, but I would say that we have to interconnect it with the situation which was in the previous stage before they became migrants, and plus, sometimes even if they are migrants, they are supported by their families who paid some money in order to go somewhere, and those families stay still in the place. So they are interconnected, and later maybe when migrants start to get some money and so on, work elsewhere, they can send money back to the family. So it's interconnected, this, I would say, political, economic, and war, injustice, and so on. So I think that this is the, how to look at the other interests of cosmopolitan agents who are migrants. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be trying to be very brief to these really good comments. Regarding cultural cosmopolitanism, I didn't really say anything in the presentation, and maybe we could talk in the break a little bit. I think it's an enormously complex issue, and it adds other dimensions that I'd like to hear a little bit more why you're asking about that. Regarding the question about the sources of migration, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think a part of this is part of what you might think of an ethics of migration or an ethics of mobility. And what I actually have argued for is that we should move away from migration and more towards mobility, because what a lot of movement is it's forced movement. I think we mentioned in the morning Saskia Sassen's accumulation by dispossession, and the ways in which different types of economic processes force people to move. So there's economic aspects, obviously there's foreign policy aspects, and it's a deep moral wrong to destroy somebody's home and livelihood and force them to move. And I think that's one of the sort of central lenses for thinking about the ethics of migration. To what extent is it compulsory? I do want to step away from that a little bit, because as you mentioned, forced stasis is as bad as forced migration. And often we pay a lot of attention to people who are forced to move, often trying to stop them, or contain them in certain ways. We don't pay enough attention to people who are unable to move. People caught in war zones, for example, that can't migrate. And so I think the dispossession and the coercion aspects are really central for thinking about these issues. I do think it's maybe a bit of a different talk than thinking about the political institutions. But the political institutions, again, we have to think about political institutions so that would make it such that migration actually was voluntary. And I think that's sort of a criteria. How can we move toward a world where people aren't dispossessed, people aren't forced to stay? And I think a lot of this talk is tentative because I don't know the answer. That's why I'm waving my hands for cosmopolitanism from below. But nonetheless, I hope at least to sharpen some of the categories for thinking about, where to think about or where to move toward to get a more definite answer. So thank you for your questions. They were deeply challenging and useful to me, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.